evening, welcome to the second season of MCL Talks. And like we have preempted before in the last episode of the first season, we will have guests in these episodes. And tonight's guest is a very good friend of ours, of the MCL, and a good friend of Southeast Asia. He's kind of well known in this region, but he's also known in the country where he comes from, Germany. His name is Max Riefer. And I'll just read a few lines from his biography. It's a very complex biography, so to say. If you want to know more about Max, he has this website, which we could put in the description later. The subtitle is very interesting in this biographical sketch of Max. It says he's on the search for a new musical language in the intercultural and interdisciplinary environment of Southeast Asia. Very interesting. Max Riefer studied in Freiburg at the Freiburg Musik Hochschule with the famous Bernhard Wolff. He's a famous percussionist with Professor Taijiro Miyazaki, the timpanist, and with Pascal Pons, the marimbist. And he became very familiar with the 20th and 20th century repertoire, even as a student. He started playing collectively with an ensemble, even in the early age of 18. He had his first ensemble. He came to the Philippines in 2011 as a member of the ensemble put up by Professor Dieter Mack called Ensemble Feliz. But before that, he came to Japan, and he came into Vietnam. He's presently teaching in Malaysia, based here in Southeast Asia at UITM, University Technology Mara, and as a percussion professor and as director of the percussion ensemble. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Max Riefer. I like to call him Professor Max Riefer because he is a professor, to speak about percussion in Southeast Asia, the percussionist. He will elaborate on this topic. Max, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Thank you very much for having me tonight. This is very exciting because, as you mentioned, the MCL in 2011 was sort of my kickstart to explore Southeast Asia, even though I have been to Vietnam before, but that was sort of, I was a student at that time and it was within this festival. But then suddenly at MCL 2011, I had the chance to really meet and get to know a lot of interesting and relevant people here in the area. Thank you very much for calling me professor. I know that's how it has been, or how it is used to be done in the Philippines. I enjoy that. Unfortunately, here I'm not yet. I think I should mention that because before somebody complains. But no, I appreciate it. Thank you. Let me go on with this MCL 2011. As I said, it was my first time being in Southeast Asia in a more prolific role with Ensemble Feliz and Dieter Mack, like a very important concert trip. And I slowly got fascinated with the area. And thanks to MCL in 2011, I got all my contacts. So starting then, I got all invitations to Singapore, to Malaysia, also later to Indonesia, to Thailand. And for me, it was always important not just to go somewhere and play a concert and then leave again. For me, it was also important to see what's going on in there where I go, where I play a concert. How is the environment there for percussion, for new music, contemporary music? We will talk about terminology a bit later. So then in 2015, I got this offer to become the director of percussion studies at UITM. And at that time, I thought it's a very exciting thing to do. And it is very exciting to live here. So you talked about this, it said on my website, it's like on the search for a new language in the intercultural environment of Southeast Asia. I think this is almost like a paradise here. We have this German term Schlaraffenland when we look at percussion music. And that is also a bit difficult in terms of terminology. I will talk about that. But for percussionists at first, when they come here, this is fantastic. You have all these wonderful instruments, all these very rich cultures of playing music. So I think I would like to talk about first, from my perspective, what is this contemporary music, contemporary percussion? Most of you know this, but I think it's important to set the frame for our discussion later. So when we talk about this contemporary classical music, that's the music that derives from Western classical music of the 20th century in the centers of Europe and also later in the US. However, in this discussion, or in general, when I have discourses like that, I would like to avoid the term Western when I talk about contemporary classical music in Southeast Asia. The reason for this is that through this cultural exchange that has been going on for over 50 years, when we think about when José Maceda or Slamet Abdul Shukur came back from their studies and trips from France and the US, they brought their ideas back. And since then, there have been so many influences on this music, on these thoughts, that it actually, I think it would not be accurate. It would not be accurate to call this Western contemporary music, because I think it has been localized a lot already, purposely, not, you know, with purpose or intentionally, unintentionally, but still it has been localized. So I think calling it Western does not represent it fully. That's why I would like just to call it contemporary percussion. Contemporary music, contemporary percussion. And also when we look at percussion, it's very funny how people say, yeah, this is Western percussion. But then let's ask where all these instruments are from. Almost none of these instruments are from Europe, right? So I think the term contemporary percussion, maybe contemporary classical percussion, is a good general but not too general term to describe what I do. Yeah, so this idea of contemporary percussion has been with me for a long time. I remember when I was 14 and I played a bit in a rock band, I played drum set, I always felt not satisfied with this. And I have highest appreciation and I admire all these great drum set players. But somehow for me, there was always something missing. And thanks to my very first teacher, before I started uni, I already explored Cage and Stockhausen a bit. But that was enough sort of to open my eyes and ears for this, that there's something else than the rock band. So, and then I was so lucky to come to Freiburg and study with Bernhard Wolff, Tajiro Miyazaki, Pascal Pons, but then also all these great composition teacher, Matthias Sparlinger was there at the time. So I got all these great influences. You know, it opened up such a world for me. So this search for the unheard was something so important to me. So this is, for me, the most important thing. And it's very interesting here in Southeast Asia when you talk to people, professionals and non-professionals, and you ask them about percussion, the first thing they say is rhythm, beat, you know? So which is not wrong, but for me, it's definitely sound. I think we percussionists, we have this beautiful universe of instruments and their sounds, you know. Violinists, pianists, they have their instrument. And I mean, gosh, we all know how difficult it is to play the piano or the violin beautifully. And Stephen Schick said it in a beautiful way. He said they are all specialists. I think that's how he said, but like pianist. But then he asked, this is in this one lecture, he said, but then what are we, percussionists? Are we really experts? And I think we are, but that means we are the experts of all these sounds. so this is sort of like the most important thing for me as a percussionist. Every object basically can be used as a musical instrument. However, and now there is this connection with Southeast Asia, we at the same time have to be aware of the object. So let's say I use a gong, I take it from a gamelan set. I should be aware of what is the context of this instrument mainly, or where does it come from? Of course, you could say, well, it's just a gong, I hit it, but for, I don't know, like when you have certain settings, for people playing this gong has a different meaning, has an additional meaning, may it be spiritual, may it be ritual. And this is this fine line between things. I find this extremely fascinating. And here in Southeast Asia, I feel that instruments have such a strong character, not only musically. So being aware of all these things is a very interesting field for me to work with. Yeah, to, as I said, to find this new language in this intercultural environment. Another thing when I talk about contemporary percussion, it is always important for me that we don't play too much of this pop music repertoire. So there's this, I don't know, this unlimited repertoire of marimba pieces that all go a bit groovy and a bit poppy and all that. Well, of course, it's never wrong to play that. Just for me personally, I never really understood what this is all about. Simply because, I mean, yeah, we have pop music, like the Western popular music. There's film music, there are all these genres, and where this kind of music fits in, and whoever wants to play it, please. I'm not against people playing it. Just for myself, I never really understood how this fit into my field, into my perception and perspective of percussion music. So this leads me a bit to the situation of contemporary percussion in Southeast Asia. So first of all, I think with a lot of, when you do research or in this field, in this intercultural field, there's always these problems with terms and terminology. When I talk about contemporary percussion music in Asia, a lot of people think I talk about pop, rock, and jazz. Because in Southeast Asian academia, a lot of people, or the term contemporary is often used for pop, rock, and jazz. I have this very funny story. Maybe in my second or third semester teaching at UITM, I could teach the contemporary music ensemble. So I started this. And I had kids applying, and they came, and we were in the first session, and I had to see a little bit what the level is. I had pieces prepared, but also I wanted to see what's going on. So we started with an improvisation. So we did some free improv. And I saw a guy on his guitar, and he was like really shocking. And, and I said, hey, just, let's do 1 minute. Just play whatever you think. So it was just a kickstart, just to start. And the boy was completely shocked. And then after this minute, he was like, sir, what is this class? And I said, yeah, it's contemporary percussion music. But I already could sense. And he said, but is that all we're going to play? And I said, no, I have prepared pieces. Good. So we kept going, and I could see that he was completely confused. In the end, he thought contemporary percussion ensemble means we're going to play some tough rock music or some jazz. So there's always this problem of terminology. And I mean, matter of fact, we look at what contemporary means. It just means the music of our time, right? A more difficult problem in a way for me is that percussion in Southeast Asia is often referred to drums, marching band, and people use it for traditional music. Marching band, that's very clear. We have this very strong marching band scenes in Thailand, of course, in the Philippines, in Malaysia as well. which has, of course, I mean, colonial aspects. When we talk about traditional, when they call traditional music percussion, so for me, there's a problem with that. I don't like to use the term percussion for local art forms. That simply because, when I talked about gamelan before as an example, but there are so many other examples we can talk about, it's not only the use of instruments, it's simply that a gamelan orchestra, although we have, after hornbostel sax, clearly gong instruments or skin instruments or metal instruments, skin instruments, they don't refer to it as percussion. So, and when we look at the languages, I know for sure from Indonesia and Malaysia, and I think in the Philippines it's similar, there is no local word for percussion, but percussion or percusi. So we see this concept that we have is initially not a local concept. So here's the thing, this is initially a Western kind of concept. So in order to sort of, well, I would say divide this a little bit, so to make clear that when I talk about percussion music, I'm not talking about this very rich and very strong, I don't know, all these local art forms. So despite they use percussion instruments, I think we should call these kind of musics as they are called from the local players. But then again, this is what contemporary classical music, percussion for me is all about. Whenever we take an instrument out of this context and we place it into this new surrounding, let's say we've gotten familiar very much with the use of a certain gong, and we know, yes, we can use it without offending people, without offending a ritual or something like that. We can take it out and use it in this new setting of contemporary music. This also indicates that it's very difficult to really separate these things as well, right? Because where do we want to draw the line of what is contemporary classical? Where is the Western influence? Where is it local? Is there a line? Because when we look back, I always talk about gamelan today, I don't know why. When we look at the Central Javanese gending mares, this is a gamelan form where they have marching instruments in bass drum and trumpets and so on. That is, if I'm not mistaken, 100 to 120 years old. So I like to call this whole thing of percussion, it's a continuum. It's sort of a continuum, and the ends are even not very clear, but there are compositions that, you know, might be more towards this contemporary classical that has these Western influences, and then there are these compositions that are much closer to the local art forms, and of course there are all these contemporary local art forms. We have all these new compositions for gamelan or kulintang, fresh from 2020. So it's quite complex to talk about these or to talk about the music that I play, but I think with all these explanations, we have sort of a frame, and we also know this is a flexible thing. It wouldn't be right to, you know, build a wall and say like, okay, this is contemporary Western influenced, this is traditional. Difficult term anyway. So when I came then to Southeast Asia to work here, I started looking for pieces. I thought, as much as my students have to learn all these Reyes and Xenakis and Stockhausen, of course they have to learn this, but at the same time, what is existing in the area? So I started working with people like all of you. Jonas, you wrote this very beautiful piece called Babandia in 2012. So I firstly played music that was rather new, you know. But then I also thought, when was the first piece written for percussion by a Southeast Asian composer? This question might sound a bit naive, but it kept me, you know, it was sort of the drive to say like, how far does this go back? And I found, and I was so happy to see that Ramon Santos wrote his time improvisations in 1970. So now when we look back, 1970, when did the first percussion pieces that are known today, when have they been composed? We have The Cage, 27 minutes. We have Anterior by Helmut Lachemann from the 60s. We have Zyklus by Stockhausen from 58, I think. But then already in 1970, a composer from the Philippines wrote a percussion solo piece. And this piece, interestingly, is not very known in the scenes in Europe and the US. So when I talk to people, almost nobody knew about it. And I think only in Freiburg it is known, Jonas, thanks to you, because you organized the performance in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. So I found this interesting simply because when we talk about early pieces, nobody talks about this piece, which is clearly a very early piece, 5 years older than Psafa by Yannis Xenakis. And then also we had people like Paul Gautama Sugijo, Indonesian composer who has lived in Berlin. He wrote percussion solo pieces and ensemble pieces in the 1980s. Slamet Abdul Shukur's Jawara in the early 90s. So I realized there's actually, in a way, also a strong tradition of contemporary classical music here. But interestingly, it's not performed that often. Or not as often as I think it should be. So I made it a little bit my mission, sounds a bit too much, but I thought this is a very important thing. And I think there's so much beautiful music and beautiful pieces that need to be performed and promoted. Of course, today it's a bit easier with all the social media things, with YouTube and Facebook and all that. So young composers can promote themselves much more, but still the older pieces are underrepresented. To give you a little example of what I'm, one of the pieces that I find interesting that is sort of on this, what I said, continuum between classical contemporary influences, but also has sort of local roots without trying to be Indonesian music. I think, so I talk about a piece by an Indonesian composer, Septian Vicayo. I want to show you this piece just a little bit, so I can explain a little bit as just an example why I'm fascinated with this repertoire. well, this was a video recorded together with, I mean, it was obviously me, and then together with Kunst, who's the solo timpanist of the Sun Group Orchestra in Vietnam, one of my close friends, and also one of the very, very good, very relevant percussionists in the area. So I chose this piece for a couple of reasons. Well, it's a relatively new recording. We recorded this in at the beginning of February 2020. So yeah, what I find interesting when we listen to this piece, you would, you know, I mean, people would ask, okay, yeah, that's interesting. But they would say, well, clearly this is like Western, this is contemporary classical percussion. And we know how this is. Sometimes people want to know where is the composer from, and they want to know where the background is, and then they have expectations. So they probably would look into their program book and say like, oh, he's from Indonesia. I don't really hear Indonesia. Or some might say, oh yeah, there are these Bonang. Ah yeah, that must be Indonesia. Of course, that is an extremely superficial approach to this. Unfortunately, it happens more often than we all hope for, right? But what is interesting, I think I want to read this for you. Dwitunggal is a term, that's the name of the piece, by the way, I'm sorry for that. Dwitunggal is a term that we convert to English will become two things that become unity. This piece is inspired by deconstructing something to become a new thing with a new function, like we could make a tree become a table, chair, and door. Through Javanese gamelan forms ladrang and lancaran, and also Lindenmayer system, I tried to deconstruct something from the past to become a new in a manner and characteristics. So you see, this is maybe not something that is directly audible for everyone, but obviously he refers to Javanese systems. That's what he describes. And I found this, and I think it's a great example. I found this with a lot of composers in Southeast Asia. There are, if they do it well, then they think about what is my surrounding, what is my background, and then they take a decision if they want to take inspiration from that, or some clearly say, no, I don't want to, which is fine as well. And there is a lot of repertoire like this, where composers sort of think about their environment, their, like, what is cultural, social, and so on. And this can be reflected in the music. However, what I don't want at all is, again, to look for something Asian. I mean, this is, you know, sometimes you see this in concert programs, the sound of Asia, or East meets West. I mean, this is totally not what I'm into, because I think this is just way too superficial to even consider discussing. So for you to see now a little bit what the role of contemporary percussion in Southeast Asia is, and we will go more into this when we have the discussion later. But I also want to give you a little bit an overview about the developments in the last year. So I talked about this repertoire that is like, what, 50 years old. We have Time Improvisations by Ramon Santos, which turns 50 years old this year. We will have there was a performance planned for this year. We will have it next year. But it's very interesting now to live in the area, because in the last years, a lot, but let's say some local percussionists, young percussionists, went overseas, mostly to the US, and studied their masters there. They got their bachelor's in local universities as far as that was possible, and then go do their masters abroad, come back. And of course, they bring all these ideas with them. Of course, it's a bit too easy to say Southeast Asia, because every country has a bit of different education system, and also there's a different level of music appreciation, contemporary music, percussion, and so on. But clearly, these people, these students or former students who come back, they have a very important influence, a very big influence on the contemporary percussion scene at the moment. which is actually very relevant, simply because good teachers are needed. Of course, there are good teachers, but there are just not enough good teachers. So you need these people who come back with their knowledge and also their sensitivity, because they have experienced living here in the area, and they have experience living abroad. And I think this is it's always very useful and important. There are these percussion festivals, like in the International Malaysian Contemporary Percussion Festival, or there was a Malaysian Percussion Festival that was both in Malaysia, obviously. Then we had Total Percusi has a festival in Yogyakarta, but then also at MCL, percussion played a much bigger role. Then there are festivals like Sounding Now, Soundbridge, SIPFest. So there are more and more festivals who have, you know, maybe a percussion focus, or where percussion plays a much bigger role. This is possible because there are more and more players who play the kind of contemporary classical percussion music that I'm talking about. But still the problems are, and I think you composers know very well what I'm talking about. There are a lot of composers in Southeast Asia, but there are not enough performers who are either willing to play, or who have the quality to play also, to be very honest, or who are just interested. So still, I think if composers compose for percussion, that might refer to other instruments as well, but I think it's much easier to find a good pianist than a good percussionist. When you write, then the chances that the piece gets performed are not that high, unless you have someone who you work with. So this has to be planned, obviously. Unlike in Europe, I think you know well, I mean, in Graz, Feliz, there are so many percussionists walking around. So if you write something for percussion, you can be sure you will find someone who will be able to play that. The reasons for this are a bit that in the academic context, not that many universities actually provide a comprehensive percussion program. Of course, there are schools who have a pretty good program, of course. But when we look at how many universities with music departments and all that we have, there aren't that many where you actually can study contemporary classical percussion. Like you have a lot of qualified teachers for orchestra, for example. Or you have those who maybe have a bit more focus on this a bit more popular marimba repertoire and all that, which is what it is. So I'm not saying this is bad to study there, not at all. But I'm just saying I feel that still there is a lack. I think there are, besides a few universities, a lot of universities should start a percussion program, because there are a lot of young percussionists, you know, who play in wind bands, who play in these marching bands, and you can pick them up from there. Thank God for percussion. In a way, it's still somewhat possible to bring someone to an okay level within a relatively short amount of time, compared to violin, for example, or piano. But of course, it's not only done with universities, also pre-university level, where there are not enough teachers who teach this kind of things. So this is a little bit also the reason why I'm active here and why I feel it's extremely exciting. As I said, I'm definitely not the only one, but I'm one of those few. So there are a lot of projects for me to do in the area, because you know there are slowly, you know, when we talk about these festivals and so on, they want to have an expert in contemporary percussion, and yeah, I'm very happy that I get invited to interesting projects. But I also have to say, I hear more and more that my students are contacted because they got this reputation of being, why you do this contemporary stuff, right? There was a funny story from a festival. I cannot mention names, but a professional local percussionist called one of my students and said, hey, I have this score here, and it's just a graphic score. What do I do with that? So my student explained the guy how to play this, which I think it's wonderful that we can share this knowledge. Yeah, so living in this environment is, to be very honest, not always easy. But on the other hand, I mean, you know, living in Europe, there are other difficulties when you're on the scenes there. There's still, in this scene here in Southeast Asia, there is a lot growing. And at the moment, I think there are so many things that come up, and now it's the right time to, you know, to water the plants. If that's me or not, that's not the case. Not about myself, but I think now it's the right time for these kind of things, for contemporary classical percussion here in Southeast Asia. So I think that was so far from my side. I think I talked enough. Let's have a discussion. I hope you have a lot of questions.
Yes, thank you very much. But before we go into the discussion, let me just try to sum up a bit of the points you made. Very important points, actually. Apparently, one of the most important things, which apparently is kind of basic in the paradigm of what percussion music is, in the sense of a classical contemporary context like we have, is that percussion music is not about drums and all that stuff, but it's about sound. And apparently, if you look into that kind of paradigm, it will be a very interesting bridge into understanding also the kind of musical sounds we have here in Southeast Asia. The gongs, they are classified in the horn-borstel sax sense as idiophones because they're being struck. But of course, that is kind of a it's kind of a European perspective.
Totally,
right?
Totally.
And because you can in Southeast Asia are actually melodic instruments, like in the case of melodic and even transcendentally melodic instruments. I could cite, for example, the Kalinga of the Philippines, who play these flat gongs, where you have these interlocking patterns, which are a resultant of 6 people playing certain repetitive patterns. And you find that in many other parts of Southeast Asia, like the Nonggar of Vietnam, if they are still surviving after the Vietnam War in the 70s. They lived in the mountains, and I would suggest, if you like to see into that, the Nonggar gong, flat gong music, and they have this very, very beautiful resultant melody happening above the playing of the flat gongs. I mean, those are the realities of what we actually categorize as percussion. And of course, it's important to also map this notion of percussion as a category, in the sense of in the context of a concert repertoire, right? I mean, the percussion instrument, or orchestra, the percussion section. Which apparently, if you go deeper into Southeast Asia, all those boundaries are going to be blurred.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean,
and apparently, yes, it's very good that we are able to springboard from that kind of notion, as you have, of percussion sound being about sound. And you mentioned Edgar Varese earlier, and which is very significant for us Filipinos, because Edgar Varese's ionization is, if I'm not mistaken, the first piece of the European avant-garde that Maceda performed in 1964 or 63.
63, yeah, exactly.
63. And apparently, when he played that to a concert-going public, an elitist concert-going public who knows only about Chopin and Beethoven and whoever, Mozart, and he played that, everybody was like, wow, what is that? I mean, it's like so surprised. And then in the same concert, he played his composition entitled Ugma Ugma. It was the very first, I would say, the very first real contemporary music composition in this country, which apparently you would see patterns or tendencies parallel to that of Baes' ionization. One example is that in Baes' ionization, he has this, what do you call that, the siren?
Yeah.
He has these two sirens. In Ugma Ugma, Maceda used a carabao horn. I mean, with the same glissando kind of stuff. I mean, you see the modeling in a way, but you also see Maceda's, if you like to look forward, Maceda's exploration of the sound of gongs, which apparently to me was an extension of his idealism in Baes. And it was very important for us to experience that. I was a kid at that time, but somehow it contributes to my collective cultural imagination of Baes and Maceda being that connected, and the other one is Senakis and all that. And then you also mentioned about these differences of categories regarding contemporary music or contemporaries, and you are in such a very important crossroad as a person, as not only as an artist but as a person, and these conflations, these connections you are talking about, actually you're talking about yourself. You're very very rich and very dynamic in and out journey into Southeast Asia as a German who came here in 2011 and who discovered what it is to be in this, what you call a fertile land. And I think it's very important to work out from that standpoint. I'd like to address one question first before I open the floor to the others. You talk about contemporary music, but I think there in my opinion, there should be some kind of transcendence of contemporary, because we speak of contemporary music. Of course, we're also locked in within this this worldview of our milieu, how we practice music, which we'd like to call, which I don't also like to call, but at the same time I have to call as classical contemporary, right? Because the mode of performance is practically in a concert hall. The behavioral aspects of the actors. I just finished writing my book, so I'm still hot on that. The behavioral aspect of the actors in this context, no, is that the audience are listening and the performers are playing. Whereas you have other performance modes. I've experienced other performance modes of 3-day rituals of just leader chorus singing. It's very different. And this kind of transcendence, I'm talking also, this notion of classical contemporary can be also transcended in the sense of looking at other, not just personalities, but practitioners of contemporary. I'm particularly looking into a person like Gary Burton, this vibraphone player, this very, to me, he's a virtuoso.
Absolutely,
yes,
brilliant musician. Yeah.
Or the other one, Dave Weckl, the drummer, who orchestrates his drum set. I mean, these are practitioners of known, of rather popular. I don't like the word genre, but modes of practice, but who still transcend their practice into this. And I think it's a good way of looking into this kind of practice. Going into our worlds. Do you understand what I say?
Absolutely, yeah.
My question is, would you also see that happening with traditional musicians, knowing that you have, I'm sure you have encountered so many traditional musicians in Indonesia, perhaps in Malaysia or in the Philippines. Would you see that kind of transcendence happening?
Oh, actually, yeah, very much. I mean, you see, there's always, I'm juggling with terminology is always such a problem. I mean, as I said before, I mean, there are contemporary pieces, compositions that probably have been written today for for a gamelan orchestra or for a Dike Barat ensemble, you know, Kelantanese Dike Barat ensemble, or and so on and so on. So I think this, and of course you all know that, but I would like to say that this idea of traditional music is old and has been going on for centuries and has been, you know, like has been passed on from one to another, and the way how they play it today is how they played it 500 years ago. Of course, I'm sorry to say nonsense, because that's not what happens. Because you said modes of practice who that develop as well, and I, of course, I see that people who come from I always prefer to call it a bit local art forms, from local modes of practice. They, of course, I mean, they also, like, you know, like I come from this direction and they come from this direction, and this is where the interesting stuff happens. And this is what I see with composers, and that's why also the repertoire I look at. Tazo Tajuddin wrote this beautiful piece, Gamel Rawak, for it's called Gamelan for a Soloist. And of course, I mean, this gamelan cannot be played as a soloist, right? Because you need the orchestra. But I mean, you see this, there are ideas that merge and come together, and this is the exciting part. So, and our responsibility, I think, as performers is that from both sides, that we don't fall into this bit, I call this ethno kitsch trap, you know, that we say, hey, we all can jam together, and then you play a few scales over it, and it's super cool, and we're happy, and we go home. If that makes you happy, go ahead, that's fine. I think culturally and artistically, this is not a very responsible way of dealing with things. So I hope that answers your question a bit.
Yes, thank you. Any questions from the floor? Anybody would like to, along those lines?
I have one question. Just do you switch your approach when you're playing, or when you're working with other percussionists or maybe students from Germany, or from, like, when you are in Germany and you're working, you have to work with students, and then when you're in Southeast Asia, do you change approach?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. And I say the most stupid thing now that you can say yes and no. First of all, the student is a student, it's this individual. So I have to approach the student, or I have to understand the student's level, the student's needs, and so on. And I think I hope I don't make a difference if the student is from Malaysia, Indonesia, or Germany. But of course, most probably there will be probably a difference. Let's say you have people of the same age. Most probably the chances are high that there is a difference in quality, in level, in terms of technical level. So then, of course, you need a different approach. But in general, what I try is, when I'm here, I try to teach the basic things that I learned at a European conservatory. And then when I go to Europe, I try to do that too, but I try to teach them as well what I learned from here, or what the percussion scene, contemporary classical percussion scene here has to offer. And surely my students have to do that too. So I think the changes in the approaches are minor, because I hope I don't want to separate. Oh, I mean, the same as, you know, I talk about pieces and compositions. I find it also a bit weird to say, oh, he is a percussionist from the Philippines. That's why he has to play Ramon Santos' piece, because he understands this. And here I have a German student, and the German student has to play Stockhausen because they understand it. I don't believe in an approach like that.
Yes, any other questions from anybody on the floor?
Right, I'm just confused about something, and I'd like to ask for hopefully clarification. Since we're trying to clarify terms, you mentioned that Southeast Asia has a rich percussion tradition, and you also referred to this as contemporary percussion, but then you make a very conscious attempt to separate these traditions from contemporary percussion by stating that Southeast Asian tradition should not be referred to as contemporary percussion. Mm-hmm. That's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it?
Absolutely. And And I said, as you know, I said this, Southeast Asia has a rich percussion tradition or environment or something like that. And I said this at the beginning. That was sort of my idea when I came here. And it is very often, very much when guests from Europe or the US, percussionists come to the area, that's what they often think. Oh, wow, you have all these beautiful percussion instruments. That means you have a rich culture in percussion. And then going from there, I try to explain this. I mean, again, terminology is always a difficult thing, right? And where do we draw the lines? But sort of this, it describes a little bit the process that I had to go through to say with all respect, and actually, so to say with respect, for example, gamelan ensemble is not percussion music the way how we perceive it and approach it. And actually, I talked to gamelan players in Java mostly, of course, and they said, yeah, we don't play percussion music. So this is what I mean. Like, we come with these expectations and with the European conservatory knowledge that I learned, and I'm very thankful for that. But now in this context, we have to understand, we percussionists have to understand that there are different approaches and different perceptions. So, and that was sort of the process I had to go through. And this is where I sort of try to separate these things, but also I know very well you cannot just separate it clearly and say, this is that, this is that. Because there's so much music now composed that is influenced by so many different things. That's why I also say we cannot use the term Western for the stuff that we do at the moment or now. That would be completely wrong, because then at the same time we would say cars are Western or cell phones are Western. I mean, we all know that's stupid. So, and I feel a bit, if we would use the term Western for music, for the music that we do, that would be as irrelevant.
Any follow-up on that point? Perhaps to follow up on that, I mean, in a sense, I just remembered something with regards to this notion of percussion. And we're actually, we are in an interesting position here, because we talk about percussion, because you are a percussionist, but we also talk about Southeast Asian practice, which is apparently transcending that category. And sometime in 1998 or 1997, I think. Yeah, 1997. I was in a sort of a festival in Thailand. It's called the ASEAN workshop, traditional workshop for contemporary composers, something like that, along that line. And I was so lucky to have there at the same time a group from Indonesia, from the Hayu Supanga. Have you met him?
I haven't met him personally yet, no, but I read a lot about him.
He's the guy, man. And in the 90s, there was so much respect for him that even his colleagues looked to him so highly. And that time, they're gamelan players, in the Solonese tradition, but they can do it on the voices, instruments. Of course, that's expected. They have a tradition, and apparently, that time we were asked to compose music, and I said I'd like to write it for this particular group, particularly writing music for voices, for 7 voices, and apparently, which came as I think my students would know that it's called wala, nothingness, and apparently, which apparently is written in a way subtitled for gamelan musicians using their voices, and apparently that actually gave me this idea of this kind of transcendence of what the spirit of the gamelan music is, which apparently not the very notion of playing the music, but the sound and the structure. I mean, I'd like to go into that notion of structure, because if Dominic was wondering about this rather fluid, let's just call it fluid categorization, which apparently is also confusing for me. percussion music and concert percussion, contemporary music, and traditional Southeast Asian music, let's say for gongs, as not contemporary in that sense. It's kind of really I mean, that's what the world is actually. It's really like a web, and if you add to that the notion of voices being used as percussion instruments, which I actually learned that from Maceda in his work called Kubing. That notion of percussion seems to be melting here in this context. It's melting. Can you say something about that with regards to the repertoire you have encountered here in this region?
Well, I think, you know, all this terminology thing, I came to this simply because I had to explain what I do. And then you try to find a term, or you try to find terminology, ways to describe, so that people can understand without excluding something, without being intolerant towards certain kind of performance practices, and so on. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a super fluid thing. You know, that's why I said it's finding exactly a term is extremely difficult, simply because there's not one thing. There are, I wouldn't even say lines are blurred. I mean, this is all sort of a morph or moving thing. But of course, clearly we could say, oh, I had this extremely crazy experience when we talk about gamelan. I was in, you know, dancer Agung Gunawan from near Pacitan, Pelem. I went to his festival, and then he told me, yeah, there's a Wayang Kulit group from the neighboring village playing. I mean, this was such an intense experience for me. But very clearly, when I look from what I did at a European conservatory, there are, at least at first glance, not many things that we have in common. We might find certain things, such as we know how to play together, or I don't know what, but of course, these are very, very different kind of art forms. But then, well, that's, first of all, nothing bad. That's just different. But then there is this, and that's what I find interesting in the area, there's all this in between. And that is, I fully agree, difficult to really clearly give it one word, unless I would just invent something. That would be stupid too, if I do this for the sake of making people understand. So yeah, this is a very fluid and amorph thing, and some have, you know, you know, some is very interesting. When you look at composer Tony Prabowo, he would, I mean, Mas Tony, he says, no, my music is not, I have no Indonesian influences, and so on. And when you listen to his music, to some of his music, it sounds very much like, more like boulez or something, right? I mean, it is different than boulez, but it has more, if you don't know, you would maybe say, well, it sounds more like something French or so, right? If we want to use these terms, these labels. But then also, he also composed stuff when he worked with this group from with the Minangkabau group. Then suddenly the music sounds very different, right? So also here among composers, or Jonas, you're a great example as well. Pieces such as Babandir are so much different than your Pasacaglia or so. So we see also it's so difficult to really find clear lines and say this is what it is. There are no boxes. But on the other hand, when we go into not only just telling people what I do, also in academic discourse, I think we first have to sort of set terminologies, knowing that these terminologies are not a fixed definition and are subject to discussion. What we have here, what I find fantastic, yeah. Or maybe we understand at one point that these terminologies suited the moment, but as things change, we need to find other terms for it.
Well, before, yes, thank you about the Babandir and the Pasacaglia. The Babandir is actually the real me, and the Pasacaglia is the unreal me. I'd like to ask AJ Villanueva, have you written something for percussion? I think I remember one piece with film, and was it you who played Max? Or?
Yeah, I wrote something for Daisuke Kinoshita,
Yeah, I remember
played
that.
by Max, and played by this other Malaysian pianist, Nicholas
right?
Ong.
Nicholas Ong, yes, in 2013.
This is the one with film. How did you? So of course, you deal with the piano part as a piano part, and knowing the flute part, and the percussion part of the part. But that was kind of unique. I saw the video actually. Yes. Can you say something?
So it was a collaboration with an Iranian filmmaker, and it was in the Sound Bridge 2013 that it was performed, and we were partnered together with visual artists. So I was partnered with a filmmaker. His name is Mohammad Reza Shams, and the title of the film is A Cup of Oxygen. And during that time, and we had this episode a few weeks before about the silent film. The concept of the silent film is still fresh with me. That was 2013 and 2014 when we did that. So I wrote this piece in 2013. So the idea was still fresh during that time. So I took that principle in, and I think I was the one who chose the instrumentation. So I chose flute and bass flute, percussion, and piano. And first of all, I think I chose percussion because I really wanted to write with Max performing it. I wanted to take the chance. And it was an amazing experience because when I was writing it, I was just thinking about extensions of sound. And Max was talking about this earlier, that he thinks what he's doing is actually just percussion as sound. So I thought of that as well. And without any kind of reference to, Southeast Asian culture, that's what I think, but maybe it is embedded in who I am, So I just thought of these extensions of sounds with the piano and the gongs that I used during the time. And it's always a thrill to write for percussions. And in my experience with writing percussion, even here in the Philippines, I think Max has a lot to do with this. That percussionists here in the Philippines are very open to experimenting, even contemporary music. That's my experience. They are much more open. You were saying something about a pianist and a percussionist. Actually, here in the Philippines, I can find a percussionist much more faster than a pianist who wants to play contemporary music. And it's I think you have a lot to do with that. And percussionists here are very open, and they want to experiment. And maybe that is one reason why I chose percussion as well in that piece, because I'm kind of familiar with how percussionists think, with how I worked with percussionists here. And I think that indeed it is one, as you guys were saying, let's just say quote unquote genre of music that is still not fully explored. For example, myself, I have a lot of explorations in voice and a lot of explorations with piano music, but less in percussion. Of course, there are a lot of considerations. One very practical consideration is, if I have an ensemble with a percussionist, the percussionist will take 2 hours to set up, and the others are ready by 30 minutes. So that's one consideration with rentals of space here in Manila, and all of that considerations. So that's one percussion piece that I have had, and I have had a couple these recent years. But I always have fun working with percussionists. I don't know, they're as crazy, I think, as composers.
Yeah, to mention some names, you have Alexis and Chico. I think they're watching. And all the others. The other thing, which just to mention AJ too. AJ's this is odd. AJ's exploration of writing music for voice, where the vocalist will also play percussion. I think Pauline has has experienced that.
Yeah,
Pauline,
that's right.
what do you think? What can you say about that, Pauline?
Um, Speaking of experimentation, and I'm not a percussionist. I'm really um, um, a, a singer, a soprano, but I really like the idea of playing while singing, although it's hard. But in the past recitals as an undergrad, um, I've collaborated with AJ. He wrote a piece for soprano and clarinet. I think you've met her, Danelle, Janisha.
Yeah, yeah.
So um, I think also it's in his in AJ's YouTube channel. So it was my first time to sing and play at the same time. I have a cymbal which I bowed. It's my sorry if you watch it. I'm not confident with with what I did there, but I really enjoyed the experimenting part, trying to find out which works or which doesn't work, which is the correct bowing. But in my experience of trying to put this together, this piece together, um, the the part where I was looking for instruments, I've encountered this problem, and I'm sure I think you also encounter this a lot. When I'm asking my friends, also Chico again and Alexis, they're my I think go-to percussion friends when I need to borrow some instruments. The first thing that people would ask when I approach them is it, what are you gonna do with it, or because I am not a percussionist, so what am I gonna do with it, what piece or what specific uh, how do you say this, what specific I mean for what purpose, what kind of music, because it's hard to borrow instruments, especially when I personally am not really fully I mean I'm not really 100% aware of the technical terms, or I mean I just um how do you say that, parang ginagawa mo siya as you do, how do you say that in English, yung parang kinakapa mo. How do you say that in English? It's like
You're grappling.
yeah, like
Yeah.
as I go along. So I learn as I go along. So it's really hard. It takes time to explain. Um, it's very hard to borrow a bow. That's been my problem.
Oh.
Cause I also don't want to be responsible if I break it. Cause I'm not. Yeah, but I always assure them that I won't. But in my experience of play of learning how to play the instrument, it's fun. I sometimes I think if I would have another life, a parallel life, maybe I could be a percussionist. but it takes patience, because I'm not a percussionist, but I find it really hard to get to know these technical things, especially when bowing a cymbal. But the process of finding what works and what doesn't, and sound, especially talking about sound, once I get it, and once I feel that it's really one with what I'm singing, that moment that I find that how do you say that, when they're pag sakto na sila. In Tagalog, we call it sakto. The term means...
Okay, yeah, when it comes together, I don't know. Yeah,
when they come together, it's like a wow moment. But I lack that, the proper technique, because I am not really a skilled percussionist. It's hard to go back to that moment every time. So I just kind of experiment every time looking for it.
I think it's going to, with that kind of repertoire, which AJ has started for sopranos who should be playing percussionists. And if that repertoire grows, Max, you're going to have a new clientele, sopranos who want to
please.
learn to
Yes, please.
Learn to play percussion instruments. Feliz
actually-
has been.
I thought Max will perform it while singing it as well.
We can turn this around. Exactly. Very good. We can turn this around. No, but it's actually very interesting, Pauline, what you say, because you see, as percussionists, this is where it starts. Let's say somebody writes a symbol, like writes 4 symbol. Let's say, okay, it says symbol. I mean, whenever I see symbol, there are so many questions. I can just go and take a symbol. All right. But we know, like, every symbol sounds so different. How is the diameter? How thick is it? Which is very important. But then also, you know, how, like, if a symbol is handmade, they always sound different. Metal instruments in general, very much. And then the question is, what do I want? And this is something very interesting that living in Southeast Asia and performing in Southeast Asia taught me, because, you know, in the Musikhochschule in Freiburg, where I used to study, Mai knows very well, when you go to this basement and you go to the percussion rooms, and I assume it is still like that, probably, most definitely.
It was like that in my time already.
Of course, you go in, each room is filled with instruments, because somebody is practicing a cyclus, and another one is preparing for an orchestra audition, and they have to do Ardua symbols, and they try, you know, 4 different pairs, and then you go up to the storage room, which is crazy. So, you know, when you study in an environment like that, it's wonderful, because you can just really choose until you have the right symbol. Here, yeah, right. But so here's the problem. Here in Southeast Asia, a lot of schools don't have that, of course. And well, I mean, understandably, it costs a lot of money to have, you know, to have all these instruments. So what I learned as a performer then already, and actually this is something I learned through my studies with Bernhard Wulff as well. Well, you have this one symbol now. So what do you want to do? Do you want to say, no, it's not the right sound, I don't play the piece? No, you have to say, well, what can I get out of the symbol? How can I adjust? What can I do with the symbol so that it fits to what I want? I had the craziest experience when I was just first semester, on my first day of studies. The percussion ensemble of Freiburg went to Beijing, and I was allowed to be part of that. And we played Persefassa by Yannis Xenakis. So that was the first piece I learned when I was a student. Isn't that crazy? So, and then we went to Beijing. We played there at the Central Conservatory, and then we went to Tianjin. And in Tianjin at the conservatory, we came there and we were looking for all these instruments, and they had maybe 60% of the instruments. So now we're looking at something, it's a 35 minutes piece. It was supposed to be the second half of our program. So what do? Do you cancel the second half of the program when they expect, I don't want to lie. I mean, I remember we had full house, and that was like one of these huge concert halls that you find at Chinese conservatories. So there were probably 1,500, 2,000 people. So what did we do? We said, well, then we have to have a Persefassa version. We have to play Persefassa with limited material. And that worked pretty well. So, and then when you work here in this environment where this happens more often, then you just have to learn, you know, you have to improve these skills to say, okay, I have this symbol, what kind of melody do I use? Where do I play the symbol? So in a way, you get even more sensitive and even more cautious and even more aware of how versatile one instrument is, you know, of how much you can get out of this one thing. And that's so that's a little bit, Pauline, what you describe when you go there and you ask for a symbol, and Chico or Alexis might probably ask, what do you need it for? Right? That's the first question. This is one of the super beautiful things with percussion, and we can always go closer and into, like, you know, the microscopes are not good enough if we really look into sound, and this is very beautiful. Yeah.
So, one last thing, sorry. And also, I think it's a different experience when you're the singer and you play it, because the overtones that you produce, and then as you sing it, it's different every time. And that moment feels like when you finally get it, it's like, wow, that's really happening when you hear it, the sound. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Nick wants to follow up on AJ's question.
Just a question. Well, I'm gonna optimistically hope that it leads to a question. I'll start with a comment. It struck me that AJ mentioned not being able to get into the mindset of a percussionist, or at least that's what I understood from what he said. And I spent a bit of time studying percussion badly, mostly because I wanted to understand how a percussionist thinks. And I found that that is very, very difficult because of the sheer diversity of what you guys do. Because the breathing and the positioning and the mindset when you're playing a timpani is completely different from when you're playing a marimba, from when you're playing a flat gong, from when you're playing a boss gong. It's just completely different mindset. And you talked about the diversity of things within instrument families themselves, which makes me wonder, does it even make sense to think of percussion as one thing at all? I mean, strictly just musically.
Wow, that's a very good question. I think it does. But yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are certain things that we can learn. So for example, when I practice, when I teach, the snare drum is my to-go thing. To practice my skills, not only technical, there's a big misconception, I think, about snare drum playing for many people, because they see it as a technical thing, all these exercises. Actually, I think musically and in terms of sound is as important, and what you can all learn, all practice with the snare drum. We have all these different instruments, and all these different instruments, you're absolutely right, need a different preparation, you need a different breathing, you need different way of playing, all this. And then we have our mallets. So there's also, in a way, a violinist always have their own instruments own instrument with them. But whatever I play, I cannot, or depends on what I play, I cannot travel with a 5-octave marimba, 5 timpani, and a vibraphone, obviously, depending, but usually not. So, so this is a little bit what is to us, right? Our physical and mental skills and the mallets. So these are our individual things. And then we have to adjust this or adapt it to the instruments we play. So I would still say, yes, it makes sense to call it percussion as a musical unity, because that's a little bit where at least this, let me call it like Western influence, where it comes from. But also we have to be aware that still until today, whatever nobody else can play is given to the percussionist, and then we have to react to that, and we have to be flexible. For me, this is part of this being a percussionist. But I agree with you very much. Yeah, it's not as clear as it is for pianists, but again, I mean, playing piano is a beautiful thing, of course. So I'm not saying playing piano is easy at all. No. But there's just this difference that a pianist, they have their instrument, this instrument, and then they work on all these lot of different repertoires, and they, of course, they develop their sounds and all that. It's highly complex. But our complexity lies somewhere else, or additionally to that, in this variety of instruments.
Would it be fair to say then that percussionists have become the generalists? Where if I want something done to the piano, where the pianist just flat out refuses, I'd look for a percussionist.
I mean, I don't know if you can call us generalists, but yes, usually, hopefully, you find more flexibility in general among percussionists. Yes, I think so. If somebody asks me to play inside a piano, I'll do that. Then I go and I practice my inside piano part. I could imagine it is overall maybe a bit more difficult to find a string player who says, sure, I can, because actually in the end, there's not much of a difference. If I go and play inside piano with fingers and a violinist does, I have no better skills per se than a violinist. But most probably, or out of experience, rather percussionists are interested in doing that. Although I also know string players who would do that, but I'm just saying.
Sorry, I my cat did something. So Maya, I think has going to give
Maya, yes.
Now just speaking of diversity of instruments, I remember going into the storage room of percussion instruments in the Hochschule, and I was surprised to see a rubber chicken and also toy radios, a lot of children's toys actually. And maybe for percussionists, the gestures are as much as instruments as the instruments themselves, because I remember having a class with Teresa Gripchenko. So she has also a group now, if you know this Ensemble Rot.
Yeah, they're wonderful. Greetings here. No, they're super. Yeah, absolutely.
And I was lucky to have a class with her where we did a lot of, how do you say, experimental music theater. So what I noticed a lot from what I learned there and what Ensemble Rot is doing a lot right now, the gestures are as important as the instruments themselves. That actually I think the percussionists can express themselves so much that they might even not need the instruments anymore. They just need the gestures and it's done.
Yeah, I mean, gestures and physicality is a very important part when we play. We play multiple setup pieces. If I have a triangle hit in pianissimo, of course, it's a totally different motion than playing a bass drum in fortissimo or so. Then plus, let's not talk about all the different articulations that we can play. And yes, that's with every instrument, but with percussions, it's even crazier. Let's say the triangle hangs over there, and then I have to move over there, and I have to hit the bass drum, and then I don't know what I have to do next. So all this physicality and gestures, yeah, it's a very important part of our performance, definitely. And you can see all these great players that we have. They really think about. We all have to think about that when we perform as well. Not so much like how does it look? Do I look cool? But every gesture has an immediate effect on the sound, and then we are again at, what I talked about before.
I think the percussion instrumentalist, the percussionist as an instrumentalist, the percussion music as a category of composition in the same practice, is pretty much telling of what kind of developments come out in the 20th century, the way music was redefined, the way the practice was redefined, the way instrumentation was redefined. For the first time, you have, let's call it a melting pot of culture, because apparently, even within the concert repertoire, the context of concert music, instruments from other cultures are aufgehoben, sublated. I mean, they transform into concert instruments. They were ritual instruments and they become concert instruments.
Yeah.
There's nothing negative about that. It's just the reality of how much percussion as a category try to accommodate the whole world, and apparently you see that also in compositions of Dieter Mack, for example, writing for an ensemble which even without any intentions would remind us or would give us images of his experience in Indonesia. I mean, things like those. I mean, I always mention the Musik 2 and all that, and apparently I think this is what things can offer, and to look at a different perspective, sort of a perspective that is kind of, I don't know what to call it. It's a different perspective of looking at Southeast Asia itself as the stage, as the milieu of practice. That's kind of different. And I think, Max, your explorations will bear fruit in the future. Maybe we couldn't see it yet now, but I think it will open many doors, both for musicians in and outside Southeast Asia. Not only percussionists, also composers and maybe even pianists. I mean, pianists who can play percussion, pianists who, I mean, you see so much, and percussion is such a fluid term. I mean, vocalists who play percussion. I mean, it's simple in the sense that you don't have to learn how to play the tone. Yeah, but it's also very complex because there are so many articulations in certain tones. I mean, that's the fluidity of percussion. I think it's a 20th century product of a 21st century idealism that is to come. See the world around. Yeah. Any other comments? Feliz, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I have one question about what you mentioned, expectations. That for me it was very interesting that you were also encountering this, because usually it's something, maybe for example, us non-European coming to Europe or US, Canada, and we have our music, and people come to us and say, why don't you write something Asian? Or I always encounter this. Yeah, and you mentioned that you're also, if I understood it correctly, you're also getting this kind of expectations. So I'm just curious how you are addressing this in your work, maybe specific examples.
I mean, it's a little bit, yeah, a little has to do with what I said before. I mean, if I get this question all the time, like, oh, I mean, fair enough. People ask, how does contemporary percussion music from Southeast Asia sounds like? The question is problematic, but also understandable. But what I say very much, then my question back is, so, you know, I mean, if somebody says like, oh, why don't you compose something Asian? Then the question is always like, well, okay, then first of all, let's look, what is Asia? Do you really want to say that Japanese court music has anything to do with Central Javanese court music besides being court music? That's the only thing they have in common. So let's narrow down this term. And even if we talk about Southeast Asia, I mean, there's so much variety. And I think when people ask these questions, they simply don't have the knowledge. And I think it's always good to say, well, then tell me something European. How is European contemporary music? And we would very much, if we really go deeper and deeper, we understand it's an individual thing. Like composers write individually, and of course they have inspirations and influences, but there is no such thing as this is how French composers write. So, or German composers write. There are, I mean, so many Germans with a German passport who write very differently. And then we have these people who has been living in Germany for 30 years and who might not have a German passport, but they also, this is also new music or contemporary music happening in Germany. So I think when we just explain these things, then hopefully people will also understand it's not very accurate to ask for what is, or to say, oh, you are from the Philippines, you should write something that it sounds like from the Philippines.
I think it's just a matter of knowing now, realizing that we're just human beings. I mean, it's like in the 90s, I was reading Beethoven's, I think it was the 7th Symphony, and I was reading it in the Musik Hochschule library, and I don't know who came to me. I think it's one of my classmates, and I said, "Why are you reading that? Why don't you study the things of your own?" And then I told that person that, well, this is my own. I'm a human being. I have a claim to this as much as you have a claim to this thing. I mean, this is not about you are not German, so you shouldn't be reading Beethoven. But I have to learn. I want to learn about Beethoven because I'm a human being. I mean, I think, and going back to percussion as this rather fluid, rather problematic, fluid worldview. It's the same thing. I mean, you find gongs finding their way into the setup at the same time. you find in the symphony orchestra the same. I mean, I think it's really this notion of we should not actually fall victim into this mapping out the world is mapping out things. And this thing about asking why don't you write something of your own is actually a way by which people are trying to map out you as a person. I mean, your own is that, okay, you're brown and that's your own. I mean, it was very strong in the 90s in Germany, Max, because I could understand it was the time of the neo-Nazis and the time of the unification and all that stuff, and it was very strong. And apparently, that kind of mapping was very strong. Okay, you're not like us. Where do you come from? And I think we have matured for that. I hope the world matures for that after the killing of George Floyd and all that stuff. I mean, these are things that teach us about our humanity. Actually, this mapping out. We're just humans. And percussion.
I think, you know, I mean, for me, it's always a bit tricky, of course, because on the one hand, I don't, you know, what I just said, there is no such thing as, this is how composers from Indonesia sound like. Because that, on the other hand, then people could ask me, it's like, okay, then why do you look at this? And when I look at the percussion music in Southeast Asia, I just say, well, this is just, I set this frame and I look into all this that's in there without without characterizing it as such, right? So I'm not saying this thing here, these borders automatically define. It's just, I just set limits for in research they would call it what limit of the study or something like that, right? Because at one point, otherwise I can say, well, I look at the whole world and then everything gets super general, and then we might miss these beautiful diamonds that are shining somewhere further. But one more time, I'm not saying that there is a general musical percussion language in Southeast Asia. Absolutely.
Yeah. Which is apparently very true. It's in fact it's a very big statement, but it's also very enriching for us to understand and continue to explore. And I think I'm writing a trio now, and I'm trying to finish my trio for flute, clarinet, and cello, something that is not so me, Max. But I have already planned to, inspired by the VMCL, I've already planned to write something for percussion solo, which apparently is also something which is not me, because when I think of whatever instruments we call percussion, and I have like Daloy and Ganding Ninapi and those works, it's basically community, a whole 150 people in the audience playing iron nail chimes, which is also a percussion instrument. That is community to me. But I'm now thinking in terms of a soloist percussion. I'm just trying to decide what, and I think I'm going into that too. I mean, very good. Are there questions? Some more questions from anybody? Dominic?
A quick comment.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Max for saying that, for acknowledging that composers are individuals. Thank you very, very much for that. Yeah, it reminds me of an incident where I think I vaguely remember a panel of some sort. I can't remember what it was for. And I was still studying under Dita at the time. And he, I think very hesitantly offered me an out by saying, isn't this common among the flat gong cultures in the Philippines? But at the same time, knowing how he teaches, he didn't want me to take that out because the focus of his training was very much to try to draw the individual out and try to, yeah, which I very much appreciated because I don't like being put into boxes. And yeah, in the end, I think that's the thing. We compose what we compose. I remember this particular shop where I bought my pens, and I became friends with the guy who owned it. And it was expensive as hell, but He was a nice guy, so I bought my pens from there. And he asked me what kind of music I make, and I said mine. And he asked me where I'm from, and I refused to tell him. I just told him it doesn't matter. It's my music, and if you like it, then you like it. If you don't, then you don't, and that's fine. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, I think we have covered so much ground. Again, we thank Max very much for enriching our talks this afternoon. You have graced our talks so much, as you did in 2011 when you first came to the Philippines. And I'd like to thank everybody. And as a conclusion, we end the first episode of MCL Talks. And please stay tuned for the next episode. So bye for now.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay.
That was wonderful.